Have you ever felt like someone is pulling away from you? But somehow they never fully leave, like they disappear emotionally, yet they still stay connected to your life in small, confusing ways? And the most painful part, they don't say what they feel, so you are left overthinking everything, trying to decode silence like it's a language you were never taught. If this sounds familiar, then what you are about to hear might change the way you understand love, distance, and emotional connection forever. Because there is a certain kind of person in relationships who does not love in a straight line. They don't express affection in the way most people expect. They don't chase. They don't cling. They don't openly confess their emotions even when they are feeling them deeply. Instead, they hide. They step back. They create space. And yet, they never fully disconnect. And this is where most people get it completely wrong. They assume distance means disinterest. They assume silence means absence of feeling. They assume emotional control means emotional coldness. But human psychology is far more complex than that, especially when it comes to people with avoidant tendencies. Avoidant individuals are not empty inside. In fact, many of them feel emotions very intensely, sometimes even more intensely than others. But the difference is, they experience emotional closeness as something overwhelming, something that triggers fear instead of comfort. So instead of leaning into it, they pull back. Not because they don't care, but because caring feels unsafe. And here is the part most people never realize. When an avoidant connects with someone on a deeper level, their instinct is not to move closer in a simple, open way. Their instinct is to regulate distance, to control exposure, to protect their emotional world from becoming too exposed, too fast. So what does that look like in real life? It looks like inconsistency that confuses you. It looks like moments of warmth followed by sudden silence. It looks like emotional presence without emotional availability. And if you are on the receiving end of that, it can feel like you are being kept in a constant state of uncertainty. And uncertainty is powerful, not just emotionally, but psychologically. The human brain is wired to seek clarity. When clarity is missing, the mind fills the gap with questions. Overthinking begins. Patterns are analyzed. Small actions are replayed again and again, searching for meaning that is never clearly given. This is why so many people become emotionally attached to avoidant dynamics without even realizing it. Because the lack of clarity creates mental fixation, and mental fixation often gets mistaken for love. But here is the truth that changes everything. Avoidant behavior is not random. It follows emotional logic, a hidden internal system built on fear of vulnerability, fear of loss of control, and fear of emotional dependence. When someone with avoidant tendencies feels safe enough, they do not suddenly become overly expressive. Instead, they show love in quieter, more controlled ways. Ways that are easy to miss if you are only looking for obvious signs. And this is exactly where misunderstanding begins, because most people expect love to be loud, clear, direct, consistent, but avoidant individuals often operate in the opposite direction. Their affection is not always in what they say, it is in what they don't fully let go of. It is in how they stay slightly connected even when they try to pull away. It is in the way they reappear when distance grows too long. It is in the subtle refusal to completely detach, even when emotional intensity scares them. And if you have ever found yourself thinking, if they cared, they would just show it, then you are not alone. That is the most natural conclusion the mind reaches, because clarity feels safe. But emotional patterns like this do not operate on simple clarity. They operate on contradiction. And contradiction is exactly what keeps people stuck. One moment you feel important. The next moment you feel invisible. One moment there is connection. The next moment there is distance. And in that emotional gap, something powerful happens inside the human mind. It starts trying to solve the puzzle. It starts chasing understanding. It starts holding on to the moments of closeness and ignoring the moments of distance. And without realizing it, emotional attachment begins to form not from stability, but from inconsistency. Now here is where this video becomes important for you, because what you are about to learn is not just about understanding avoidant behavior. It is about recognizing the hidden signs that most people completely miss. The subtle actions that reveal when someone with avoidant tendencies is not just emotionally present, but actually deeply attached, even if they will never say it directly. And by the end of this, You will no longer confuse distance with disinterest. You will no longer misread silence as lack of feeling. Instead, you will begin to see the patterns that most people overlook completely. But before we go into those signs, you need to understand one more thing, because once you see it clearly, you will never be able to unsee it again. Why does someone act close to you one day and emotionally unreachable the next, yet still never fully disappear from your life? Why do they maintain just enough presence to keep you thinking, but never enough consistency to give you peace? If you have been in that situation, your mind is not confused without reason. There is a pattern behind it, and once you understand it, the emotional chaos starts to make sense. Avoidant individuals do not experience connection in a simple way. For them, closeness is not only comfort, it is also pressure. It activates an internal alarm system that tells them they are losing control over their emotional space. So instead of staying fully open, they regulate how much of themselves they allow others to see. This regulation is not random. It is strategic on a subconscious level. They move in and out of emotional availability based on what feels safe in the moment. When things feel light, they can appear warm, engaging, even deeply interested. But when emotional intensity increases, their instinct is to create space again. This is why their behavior often feels unpredictable. But it is not truly unpredictable. It is a cycle. They approach when the emotional distance feels comfortable. They withdraw when the connection starts to feel consuming. Then, after time passes and the emotional pressure reduces, they return again. This loop can continue for a long time, especially when there is a strong emotional bond involved. To someone on the receiving end, this creates a very specific psychological effect. It builds anticipation. It creates emotional memory spikes. The brain starts to focus more on the moments of connection than the gaps between them. And slowly, those brief moments begin to feel more meaningful than they actually are, simply because they are rare. This is where attachment becomes complicated, because human psychology does not bond only through consistency. It also bonds through emotional contrast. When affection is unpredictable, the mind pays more attention to it. It becomes more alert, more sensitive, more invested. Not because the connection is stable, but because it is uncertain. And uncertainty activates a powerful internal response. The mind starts searching for patterns that explain the inconsistency. It replays conversations, it analyzes timing, it assigns meaning to small gestures. A short message suddenly feels significant. A delay suddenly feels like rejection. A return suddenly feels like hope. This mental cycle creates emotional dependency without obvious awareness. The person does not feel trapped, yet they keep thinking about it constantly. They do not feel controlled, yet their attention keeps returning. This is how strong emotional fixation forms in situations where clarity is missing. Avoidant behavior unintentionally strengthens this effect. Because their connection is never fully gone, it keeps the emotional door slightly open. And a slightly open door is often harder to walk away from than a closed one. The mind keeps expecting it to open wider next time, but that moment rarely arrives in a clear, stable form. Instead, what arrives is another short phase of closeness, followed again by distance, and each repetition deepens the emotional imprint. At the same time, avoidant individuals are not unaware of connection. They are often very aware of it. They notice the bond forming. They recognize emotional depth. But instead of leaning into it fully, they become more careful, more reserved. Not because they lack feeling, but because feeling too much creates internal discomfort. So they learn to balance it in their own way. They maintain just enough interaction to stay connected, but not enough to feel overwhelmed. This balance is what creates confusion for others, because it does not match typical expectations of emotional expression. In many cases, their actions are subtle rather than expressive. They may not openly communicate attachment. Instead, they show it through repetition, through return, through quiet persistence in staying within reach even after stepping away. But to someone expecting direct emotional clarity, these signs can be easily misread. Distance gets interpreted as lack of interest, silence gets interpreted as emotional absence, and inconsistency gets interpreted as indifference. Yet the internal reality is far more layered. What makes this dynamic even more powerful is that avoidant individuals often do not realize how deeply they impact the emotional state of the other person. They are focused on managing their own comfort zone. Meanwhile, the other person is trying to interpret meaning from every shift in behavior. This mismatch creates emotional imbalance. One side is regulating closeness, the other side is seeking understanding, and in that gap, attachment grows in silence, not through clear communication, but through repeated emotional impact. Over time, the connection becomes less about what is said and more about what is felt during absence. The mind starts to associate the person not only with interaction, but also with waiting, wondering, and anticipating. And anticipation is powerful. It keeps emotional attention alive even when physical presence is not constant. This is why such connections can feel so intense without being clearly defined. They operate on emotional rhythm rather than emotional stability. And rhythm can be powerful enough to hold attention for long periods, even when clarity is missing. As this pattern continues, the mind begins to normalize inconsistency. It starts accepting emotional uncertainty as part of the connection. And once that happens, the bond becomes harder to break because it is no longer based on logic alone. It is based on emotional conditioning. But there is something important to understand here. Not every moment of distance means disconnection, and not every return means new beginning. The behavior follows a deeper structure, one that is rooted in internal emotional regulation rather than surface-level intention. And once you begin to recognize that structure, the way you interpret their actions starts to change completely. Why does someone come back into your life after distance, act normal for a while, and then slowly pull away again without giving a clear explanation? Why do they seem to stay connected even when they are physically or emotionally inconsistent? To understand this, you need to look beyond surface behavior and enter the deeper emotional mechanism behind it. For avoidant individuals, connection does not follow a straight emotional path. It moves in cycles of comfort and self-protection. When emotional pressure rises, they instinctively reduce exposure. When that pressure fades, they allow closeness again. This shifting rhythm is not planned. It is automatic, built into how they manage emotional safety. What makes this especially confusing is that their return is not accidental. It often happens after a period of separation. During that time, emotional intensity inside them does not disappear completely. Instead, it settles, and once it becomes manageable again, they re-enter contact. But they do not re-enter in an intense or overwhelming way. They return in a controlled manner, a message, a check-in, a small gesture that reopens connection without fully committing to emotional depth. To the other person, this feels meaningful, because after silence, even small contact feels powerful. The emotional contrast makes it feel significant, but for the avoidant individual, it is simply a comfortable way to reconnect without losing internal balance. This difference in perception is where misunderstanding grows. One side experiences it as emotional revival. The other side experiences it as manageable interaction, and both interpretations feel real from their own perspective. Over time, this pattern creates a psychological loop that becomes difficult to break. The mind begins to anticipate returns. It starts waiting for familiar signs of reappearance, and each time it happens, it reinforces emotional attention. This anticipation is not passive. It actively shapes focus. It makes the person mentally alert to any small signal. A short reply feels meaningful. A delayed response feels important. A sudden message feels impactful. The brain starts treating these moments as emotionally significant events. This is how emotional reinforcement develops without clear intention from either side. At the same time, avoidant individuals often carry internal conflict during these cycles. They do not experience connection as something simple. Part of them desires closeness, another part resists it, so their behavior becomes a constant negotiation between engagement and withdrawal. When they step away, it is not always because they want to end the connection. It is often because emotional intensity has crossed their internal threshold. When they return, it is not always because they decided to rebuild something. It is often because emotional distance no longer feels threatening. This creates a rhythm that is hard to predict but easy to recognize once understood. There is movement toward connection, followed by retreat, followed by return. Each phase is driven by internal emotional regulation rather than external expectations, and because there is no clear endpoint, the other person often remains emotionally engaged, not because they are receiving constant affection, but because the connection never fully disappears. It exists in partial form, always somewhere between presence and absence. This partial presence is what makes the bond psychologically strong. The human mind tends to hold on to unfinished emotional experiences. It seeks resolution. It tries to complete patterns. So when something remains unresolved, attention continues to return to it. In relationships like this, closure rarely comes in a direct form. Instead, it comes in fragments, moments of closeness that feel like answers, followed by distance that removes clarity again. This cycle prevents emotional completion, which keeps mental engagement alive. Another important layer is how avoidant individuals manage emotional exposure. They often prefer to reveal themselves in small portions, not everything at once, not in full openness. This controlled sharing allows them to feel connected without feeling overwhelmed. Because of this, their attachment can remain hidden under calm behavior. They may not express strong emotional language. They may not show traditional signs of deep involvement, but their actions over time often reveal continuity rather than detachment. Continuity is key here. Even when distance appears, there is often a pattern of return. Even when silence exists, there is often re-engagement. Even when emotional withdrawal happens, there is rarely complete disappearance. This pattern is what creates confusion for others because it does not fit into simple categories of interest or disinterest. It exists in a middle space where connection is neither fully present nor fully gone. That middle space is emotionally powerful. It keeps attention active. It keeps interpretation ongoing. It keeps emotional investment alive without clear definition. And the longer this continues, the more the mind adapts to it. What once felt uncertain begins to feel familiar. What once felt confusing begins to feel normal. Emotional expectations adjust to match the rhythm of inconsistency. At this stage, the connection is no longer experienced in isolated moments. It becomes a continuous background thought. Even during absence, the mind stays connected to the possibility of return. Even during silence, attention remains partially engaged. This is not because the person is forcing themselves to think. It is because the emotional system has adapted to unpredictability as a pattern. Understanding this changes how the situation is perceived, because what looks like mixed signals is actually a structured emotional cycle. What looks like inconsistency is actually regulation of closeness. What feels like confusion is often a response to unspoken emotional boundaries. Once this becomes clear, the dynamic starts to look different. Not simpler, but more understandable. And with understanding comes the ability to see what is actually happening beneath the surface of behavior. Why do some connections feel calm for a moment and then suddenly become distant again without warning? Why does it feel like progress is made, only for everything to reset into silence, as if nothing fully stabilized? To understand this deeper layer, you need to see how emotional boundaries are managed internally by people who struggle with closeness. For them, connection is not a steady experience. It is something that must be carefully balanced to avoid emotional overload. When things become too emotionally close, the nervous system reacts. It does not always respond with expression. Instead, it responds with withdrawal. Space becomes a form of protection, not because the bond is unwanted, but because intensity becomes difficult to process. After stepping back, the emotional system slowly settles. The pressure reduces. Thoughts become clearer again. At that point, reconnection becomes possible without discomfort. This is when they reappear, often acting as if nothing major happened during the time apart. This reappearance is not always driven by conscious decision-making. It is often driven by internal emotional regulation, reaching a stable point again. When stability returns, interaction feels manageable once more. However, this cycle creates a very specific experience for the other person. Each return feels like renewal. Each distance feels like loss. And over time, this repeated contrast shapes emotional sensitivity. The mind begins to associate return with relief and absence with discomfort. This association strengthens attention toward the person, even during silence. So even when nothing is happening, mentally, something is still active. This is where emotional conditioning begins to form quietly. The brain learns to stay alert for patterns. It starts scanning for signals of reconnection. A simple notification, a brief message, or even the thought of them can trigger emotional response. What makes this even more powerful is that the connection never fully resolves into closure. It remains open-ended. There is no final ending, no complete separation, and no fully stable state. Just repeated phases of engagement and retreat. Open-ended emotional experiences tend to occupy mental space for longer periods. The mind dislikes unfinished patterns. It keeps returning to them, trying to understand what they mean and where they are going. At the same time, the avoidant individual often does not realize the full emotional impact of this rhythm on the other person. Their focus is internal. They are managing their own emotional thresholds, not the emotional interpretation of someone else. So while one side is trying to find meaning, the other side is trying to maintain balance. This mismatch creates emotional imbalance in perception. One experiences intensity, the other experiences regulation. There is also another layer that deepens this dynamic. During periods of reconnection, interaction can feel surprisingly normal. Conversations may flow easily. There may be warmth, familiarity, even comfort. This creates a sense of progress. But because the underlying emotional structure has not changed, the pattern eventually resets. Once emotional load increases again, withdrawal returns, and the cycle begins again. This repetition makes the experience feel like emotional waves. Moments of closeness rise, then fall. Each wave feels meaningful while it is happening, but temporary when viewed over time. What keeps this cycle alive is not intensity alone, but inconsistency paired with re-engagement. If connection stopped completely, emotional detachment would eventually follow. But because reconnection keeps occurring, emotional attachment remains active. Each return reopens emotional engagement, each distance refreshes emotional tension, and together they maintain a continuous loop of attention. Over time, this loop affects perception. The mind starts to value small moments more than consistent absence. A short interaction can feel more impactful than long silence, even if silence is more frequent. This shift in perception is subtle but important. It shows how emotional meaning is shaped not only by quantity of interaction, but by contrast between presence and absence. Another important factor is predictability. Human emotional systems feel safer with predictable behavior. When patterns are unpredictable but repeated, the mind tries to predict them anyway. This effort creates mental engagement. So even when there is no interaction happening, thinking continues. Expectation forms. Awareness remains slightly activated. This ongoing mental presence keeps the emotional connection alive beyond actual communication. Avoidant behavior unintentionally reinforces this state. Because it does not follow a fixed schedule, it keeps the mind uncertain. But because it also includes return, it keeps hope active. This combination is what sustains long-term emotional focus. The connection exists in this space between uncertainty and repetition, not fully stable, not fully absent, just continuous enough to stay relevant in thought. And when something remains relevant in thought for long periods, it begins to shape emotional attachment more deeply than brief, consistent interactions might. This is why these dynamics can feel so intense, even without clear definition. They operate through rhythm, timing, and emotional contrast rather than direct expression. Once this structure is understood, the experience stops feeling random. It starts to appear as a repeating emotional system with clear internal logic. Why do some people feel emotionally present in small moments, yet completely unreachable in others, even when the connection between both sides has not truly ended? Why does it feel like their attention comes in fragments, never fully stable, yet never completely gone either? To understand this stage of the pattern, it is important to recognize how emotional self-protection works when closeness begins to feel overwhelming. For certain individuals, connection is not only something they enjoy, it is also something that requires constant internal adjustment. When emotional closeness increases beyond what feels manageable, an internal response activates. It is not always visible on the outside. Instead, it shows up as reduced engagement, slower replies, or sudden withdrawal from interaction. This is not necessarily a decision made with full awareness. It is more like an automatic shift toward emotional safety. Once space is created, something important happens internally. The emotional system starts to stabilize again. Thoughts become less intense. Pressure decreases. The feeling of being emotionally exposed fades. And when that happens, the person becomes capable of reconnecting without discomfort. This is why re-engagement often appears after silence. It is not random. It is a return to a state where interaction feels safe again. But what makes this cycle difficult to understand from the outside is how normal the return can feel. There is often no dramatic explanation, no clear acknowledgement of distance, and no obvious emotional transition. interaction simply resumes, as if it was paused rather than interrupted. This creates a unique psychological effect. It makes the connection feel continuous in memory, even though it is fragmented in reality. The mind fills in the gaps between interactions with expectation and interpretation. Each moment of reconnection becomes emotionally weighted. Because it follows absence, it feels more significant than it would in a stable environment. The contrast increases emotional impact, and increased emotional impact strengthens memory retention. Over time, this pattern creates a form of emotional anchoring. The mind begins to associate the person with cycles rather than steady presence. It starts to recognize a rhythm of engagement followed by withdrawal, then engagement again. This rhythm becomes familiar, and familiarity often leads to emotional attachment, even when consistency is missing. At the same time, the individual on the avoidant side is not typically trying to create confusion. Their focus is on managing internal balance. They are monitoring how much closeness they can handle without feeling overwhelmed. When that limit is reached, they instinctively reduce exposure. But because emotional limits are not fixed, the pattern appears irregular. One moment, they may seem open and engaged. Another moment, they may seem distant and detached. The shift is not always predictable, even to them. This unpredictability creates strong mental engagement in the other person. The mind tries to identify triggers, patterns, and reasons behind the changes. It becomes alert to subtle cues. It starts to analyze timing, tone, and behavior for hidden meaning. This constant interpretation keeps attention focused. Even when there is no direct interaction, thinking continues. Emotional awareness remains active in the background. What strengthens this effect further is partial accessibility. The connection is never fully cut off. There is always some level of potential recontact. That possibility alone keeps emotional awareness alive. If something were completely closed, the mind would eventually adjust and release it. But when something repeatedly reappears, even briefly, it prevents full emotional closure from forming. This lack of closure is one of the strongest psychological anchors in human experience. It keeps memory active. It keeps attention returning. It prevents full detachment from developing naturally. In this type of dynamic, emotional meaning is not built through steady interaction. It is built through contrast. Presence feels impactful because absence exists. Absence feels significant because presence returns again. This contrast shapes emotional perception over time. It slowly changes what feels normal. Instead of expecting steady engagement, the mind begins to adjust to fluctuation. And once adjustment happens, emotional sensitivity to those fluctuations increases. There is also a deeper internal conflict happening within the avoidant side. While distance provides relief, complete disconnection does not always feel comfortable either. So there is often a middle ground maintained, where connection is preserved but limited. This middle ground allows interaction to continue without emotional overload, but it also prevents full stability from forming. The connection remains in a state of controlled limitation. From the outside, this appears as inconsistency. From the inside, it is regulation. Because of this difference in experience, both sides interpret the same behavior differently. One side may interpret distance as emotional withdrawal. The other may see it as necessary breathing space. One side may interpret return as renewed interest. The other may see it as safe re-entry into communication. This difference in interpretation is what sustains emotional confusion over time. As cycles repeat, emotional memory becomes stronger. The mind starts to remember not only what was said, but how it felt during transitions. The feeling of waiting, the feeling of return, the feeling of sudden distance all become part of the emotional record. And emotional memory is powerful. It shapes attachment more than logic does. It keeps people mentally connected even when clarity is missing. At this stage, the connection is no longer just about interaction. It becomes about anticipation. The expectation of what might happen next becomes more emotionally active than what is currently happening. And anticipation is one of the strongest forces in human emotional engagement.